Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Paul Gilding, an Australian environmentalist and sustainability consultant. He is on the faculty of Cambridge University's Program for Sustainable Leadership. Gilding has worked as an environmental and social activist for 35 years and is a sought-after and influential commentator on the climate crisis and its impact upon society, the economy, and the planet. Gilding has served as the head of Greenpeace International, built and run 2 companies, and advised Fortune 500 corporations as well as community-based NGOs. He is the author of The Great Disruption, Why the Climate Crisis Will Bring on the End of Shopping and the Birth of a New World, published in 2011. On November 15, 2011, Gilding gave a lecture titled The Mother of All Conflicts, Infinite Economic Growth versus a Finite Planet. His presentation was the Oregon Humanities Center 2011-12 Cressman Lecturer. It was part of the Center's year-long conflict series. Paul, welcome to UO Today.
Good to be here, thank you.
We've put you to work while you're here in Oregon. Thank you so much for your time. I want to start with a very basic question. Few people now, or fewer and fewer, deny that climate change is happening and that it's significant. So why aren't more fundamental changes being made more quickly?
Yeah, no, it is the question of our time, and it's the question that the next generation will ask of us. What was happening at that time? Why didn't you respond when it was so clear? And I think the answer comes from a look at history, really, is that we tend to, as a species, have a habit of avoiding long-term issues, focusing on the short term. We tend to have a habit of avoiding change if we possibly can, and therefore putting change off. And we see this in our personal life, in running a farm, running a company, running a society. We tend to put things off if we can, because change is difficult, change is challenging, change requires us to do things differently. And so I think it's a natural tendency. The problem with this particular issue is the change is more complex because the issue is bigger. And when the issue is bigger, we tend to look for more reasons to avoid change. So in many ways, the bigger the issue gets, the more dramatic the change we need to make becomes, the longer we put it off. And so I think that's what we're seeing now, is as the evidence gets stronger, we still don't respond. And what that implies, of course, is that when we do change, the change is going to have to be more dramatic and more rapid in terms of its rollout across the world.
In your book, you say that what you call the Great Disruption is pretty much inevitable. What is the Great Disruption?
Yeah, and it's carefully chosen words to recognise that we're not kind of facing collapse or the end of civilization. We're facing a disruptive period. And it's great in the sense that it's global and it is economic. And I think we're seeing it today. So I think the current financial crisis is not just another recession. There are some fundamental sort of system-shaking changes going on. We see that with the Tea Party, we see it with Occupy Wall Street, where people are saying the whole system is broken, we have to change things quite profoundly from both sides of politics. We're seeing it in terms of the level of change in the ecosystem that we are seeing already, that we are seeing dramatic changes, incredible flooding in various states in America, in Australia certainly, and incredible droughts and wildfires, dramatic physical impacts that we're seeing affecting the food supply around the world. And we're seeing it in the economy. We're seeing it with food prices at record highs, with oil prices approaching again record highs that were just set a few years ago. So I think we're seeing this disruptive process begin, and we're entering into it because we're still in denial as to what the cause is. We think somehow we can get back to normal soon, and this is the new normal. So we are now in a new phase of economic life, if you like, where the issues that we think about, climate change, sustainability, inequity and so on, are actually new shaping issues for our economy.
But it does seem as though you're saying that the economic disruption is going to precede or is moving ahead faster than the ecological one.
Look, I think not so much moving ahead faster, but moving ahead faster in recognition. So I think the ecological changes have been happening for decades, frankly. And if you talk to any farmer, they talk about how the weather is changing and may not agree with the causes, but agree that change is happening. And then what we're seeing though is that we tend not to respond to those issues because we see environmental change as hard to measure or hard to be precise about. We don't fully understand the process. Whereas when the economy goes bad, unemployment goes up, we notice. And so we respond to that more strongly. So I do think that we are going to see a response to the economic consequences of this being more dramatic, if you like, than the ecological responses.
And the rumblings that are going on right now, the recession, the unemployment problems, that all of which we tend to see as temporary and perhaps on the way back to a state of stability, that we're not actually headed back to where we were.
No, the sort of past is very much over. The idea of infinite growth, the idea that we can keep on pump priming an economy, that we can live on, shopping, consumerism as being the sort of central idea of our society, all those ideas are in their death throes. I don't mean that kind of suddenly all gone, will never happen again. What I do mean is that the system is now dying. The system that we used to have is falling over. The system which depended upon artificial levels of debt to pump prime an economy, the level of debt that we personally had to borrow against our houses to finance consumption, all that money going to China in return for goods coming back to America and Australia and so on. All that whole process was a very artificial economy. It wasn't a real economy. It was a kind of a fake construction, if you like, that couldn't be sustained, because it had to depend upon resources that can't be drawn down that strongly, which is why we see food prices so high. It's why we see oil prices so high, because this sort of physically based economic growth model is coming to an end.
You use the term end of shopping in your title, and no doubt it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. You approach all of this with great good humor, which I think leavens the message. But you're using shopping as representative of an overinvestment in a consumerist society, right?
Yeah. And let's remember, this is not coming from a bad place. I mean, when we were hungry, when we didn't have homes, when we didn't have enough food to last through winter, which is the history of humanity until relatively recently for most people, then hoarding, getting hold of, securing supplies, looking after yourself was really a survival technique. And then through this century and last century, we've kind of gone in that transition from being in struggle to have enough physical resources to having frankly too many physical resources in Western countries. So of course, people in poverty, different story entirely. But for those of us lucky enough to live in the US or Australia or Europe, most of our basic needs are met for most people. And yet we keep on having this sort of artificial belief, this delusional belief, I'd argue, that more stuff is going to make us happy. Now, people of my parents' generation look at that and go, well, that's crazy. I mean, there's just so much stuff, and you don't need that much stuff. And where's the natural sense of thrift or looking after things gone of the previous generations? And that, I think, is something we've lost and something we have to get back, because I do think we are facing a very different time ecologically and in terms of financially, and getting ready for that new world I think is very important. So shopping, which has ceased to become a functional, necessary activity and started to become a recreational activity, is what we do for entertainment, what we do for distraction from our lives. I think that model of social progress is finished.
You gave a really remarkable commencement speech a couple of years ago. It was in September 2006 at the University of Technology, Sydney. Which is remarkable for various different reasons. But one of the things you said in that address was that we are slightly evolved monkeys. Do you mean that we've evolved past the need purely to seek food and now do it recreationally?
Yeah, I think the issue is that we have to recognise that it's really a way of saying that we're still developing as a species, that we kind of forget how just 100 years ago, 200 years ago, how life was very different. And that certain behaviours which have been ingrained into us from thousands of years of development of humanity, right, are actually still in progress, right? And it is a conscious decision. It's the role of religion in our lives, the role of the state in terms of laws and regulations to have certain behaviour against drink driving, for wearing seatbelts, for contract law in business and so on. All these things are about putting controls around our behaviour, recognising we might have certain urges from our history, right, which need to be overcome with rules and values and culture, right, to behave in a certain way. So slightly evolved monkeys is really just saying that we're kind of in progress, right, that we're not quite there, and that we have this aspiration for what humanity should be and how we should behave. And the reason we have people in prison is because we don't always behave the way we'd like to behave, right, as a people, and therefore we have to sort of recognise that's a process going on. And something we can keep on evolving, and that we can keep on developing, not evolving physically, but evolving in terms of our culture and our values and our belief systems to go to a higher plane, if you like, of consciousness, and go to a higher level of awareness about what makes a good society. And the reality is that shopping doesn't make us happy. Community does make us happy. Having good connections to our family does make us happy. Now, these things we know now, and we have to kind of organise our economy around these ideas and organise our society around these ideas, rather than economic growth being the kind of central idea of progress.
Another thing you mentioned specifically in your talk is that one goal to strive for right now is to cut our consumption by 10%. So that seems like a reasonable thing to do. But what happens to the unemployment situation?
Yes.
What happens to living wage jobs if we suddenly reduce our consumption by 10%?
Yeah, and it's really kind of a symbolic way of communicating what the broader economic challenge is that we have to recognise that given there aren't enough jobs, given we can't keep on having a stuff-based economy where we just get more and more stuff to drive the process of economic growth to create the jobs, that's not physically possible, even though it doesn't work anyway and has a whole bunch of social problems. It's actually not physically possible because there aren't enough resources to support 7 billion people behaving that way, let alone 9 billion where we're going. So that's not possible. So let's think about what that economy looks like post that phase. And what it looks like, and I use this as an example to help us think about it, is imagine buying 10% less stuff. And could you do that? And the answer, of course, is we all could, because we all buy too many things with money we often haven't got. And then imagine them working 10% less. So imagine 5 weeks holiday a year extra. And that really kind of frames in a simple way what the economy needs to look like, which is we work less, we have less money as a result, we buy less stuff as a result, and we have more time as a result. And that time we use to do things that are good for our community and good for ourselves, that actually give us an increased quality of life, whether it's exercising, being active, whether it's helping our community, helping other people to be more happy in their lives, whether it's about building communities more strongly, whether it's growing food. The things that actually are proven now to improve our quality of life take time, not money. Right? Therefore, we have to think about this economy and how we, to answer your question about what do we do with the jobs, is the answer is we work less and more people work, but work less time. And that's all we need to move to. When I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, the assumption was we're going to live in this sort of Jetsons type world, this cartoon series of a modern, space age family, right? And technology would be so advanced, none of us would work anymore, right? Or at least we would not work very much. Now, what's happened, of course, is that we are working harder. We're working longer hours, and we're less happy than we were as a result, because anxiety levels go up. And that whole kind of productivity idea is a good idea. Progress is good, technology is good, technology makes our lives better in a whole range of ways, but we have to get the benefit from that. And the benefit comes from working less, from having more time, and having a better life as a result.
The degree of excess, the degree of blind assumption about consumerism is not the same in various parts of the world. So you say that America, the U.S., is a particularly egregious example. How would you compare what's happening in this country with what is happening, say, in Western Europe or in Australia, your own homeland? Yeah,
so Australia is very similar to the U.S., very much like-minded in lots of ways, and one of them is our levels of consumption and CO2 emissions and pollution are definitely up there with yours, a very coal-based kind of economy. Europe is less so, but not dramatically less so. I mean, not compared to India or China, for example. So you get these different attitudes happening around the world, different levels of consumption and so on, partly driven by local economic or geographical circumstances of density or culture, and partly driven by, political decisions about, how they would like to organise their society. So one of the strongest examples there is equality. So there are some countries like Scandinavian countries, Sweden and Norway and so on, who have deliberate policy which has their societies more equal. So the poor are less poor, the rich are less rich, right? And that gap is lower. And interestingly, they have lower levels of imprisonment, they have lower levels of crime, they have lower levels of negative health impacts, they have better social kind of outcomes. And that's and they have strong economies in that process. Now, it doesn't apply to all of Europe. We've all seen recently the sort of Greek and Italian debt crises, and that's they're not as well run countries in that regard. But they're differences that are quite important. And then, just in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, for example, Australia is up with the US at high 20s in terms of tonnes per person. China is at 4, India is at about 2. So really dramatic differences in terms of how much pollution each individual causes. And so that gives us a sense of how the change is going to occur, is that we have to actually all come together with a sort of per capita, if you like, way of recognising that the limited resources of the earth, with its ability to cope with pollution or whether its ability to provide the resources we need for food and so on, are going to have to become more equal over time to have any sense of fairness in society.
You've had a lot of press about the book. You're often quoted in the print and in on TV and on the radio. Thomas Friedman in the New York Times calls you an eco-optimist. And if I understand your message correctly, you are saying that paradoxically this big crash or disruption that is coming also represents an opportunity. So how is that going to bring out the best in human nature?
Yeah, it's really interesting to look at history both personally and across society in terms of how we respond to crises. Right, so there's something in us, and I sort of paraphrase this as saying, when things are going well, we behave badly. When things are going badly, we behave well. So if you look at any kind of physical natural crisis, whether it's a hurricane, tornado, tsunami in Japan and so on, people come to help, and people make enormous efforts to try and support each other, to help their community, to help those who need need immediate support. And so we tend to behave really well in a crisis, and we see that in times of war when people make sacrifices for the greater good. We see it at a personal level. If you have a crisis of a health diagnosis or a tragedy in the family, people come together. So we tend to behave really well in a crisis. Now, the good news in this is that we're going to have a big crisis, right? So we are going to have a problem. The good news in that is that we're going to have a good response, and we are very capable as a people, as a society, of responding well in that situation. So shortages, tend to bring out the best in us. We, in World War II with rationing, we saw people behaving in a very, I don't mean 100%, and obviously there's black markets and things go wrong, but the general trend is towards, recognising the greater good in that process. And that's why I think if you combine that with our incredible ability to transform economies and societies and technology when we really put our minds to it, and then you remember as well as that fixing these issues, climate change, resource constraint, food production and so on, these are not hard to fix. We know what to do. The scientists and the experts and the companies involved know what to do. We just haven't got the policy in place or the decision to act, and that is the issue. So that's why I'm optimistic, is that even though I see a crisis coming, and I see it as impacting on food supply and energy prices and a whole range of areas, I also see that we know how to fix it, and that we're very good in a crisis, and therefore we can expect that response to be very strong.
One of the things that worries me about that particular theory is that in times of war, in times of natural disaster, we tend to go about this in an integrated way with a top-down series of restrictions or legislations or orders, rationing or federal emergency disaster response. How do we prevent going into a kind of a repressive regime to make sure that what you're saying we will need to do actually happens?
Yeah, look, I think there is a risk of that, and I think there will be some of that. So I think in war, and I mean the war analogy has similarities and dissimilarities. I mean, obviously in this case, declaring the war on climate change isn't going to involve killing people, right? So it's not like the level of violence, the level of state control needed to do that is different and not as bad. So that's sort of the good news in this process. But in times of crisis, we do tend to accept a higher level of intervention for security reasons. Apart from anything else, there's the way people, behave in a crisis in New Orleans, for example. You had to have a high level of security to make sure that we stayed under control, and that's that kind of slightly evolved monkeys thing, that you need to have force in place sometimes to deal with those issues. These issues are not quite like that. These issues are about resource supply. They're about food production. They're about the type of energy we use. So they're much easier to handle. Now, there could be crises in some countries with food shortages. Now, if we have famines in certain developing countries, we may see large refugee flows. We may see the need for intervention at that level, both globally and locally in that context. So I think we'll see some of that, but I'm not as concerned as I would be in a war, because in a war you have a kind of a personally defined enemy, right? And so security and intelligence and secrecy and so on, it comes to the fore. Whereas we're primarily here talking about a kind of economic transformation, and therefore the level of intervention by the state, can afford to be a lot lower in terms of the impacts on our quality of life.
You spend a lot of time in the United States, but you still come from elsewhere and have a more distanced and critical understanding of what's going on in this country. There is a huge discrepancy, as you say, between what's happening on the national level, the governmental, political level, and what's happening locally in places like Eugene, Oregon, where a lot of people are doing a lot of things to help move the effort forward. How do you explain that discrepancy between national political discourse and what's happening locally?
Yeah, look, it's very hard to explain, and it's hard to understand, frankly, as an outsider sometimes, because you see in many ways in America, you see the most innovation, the most creative approaches, the smartest people in the best universities, developing the solutions and working out how we need to move forward. And then you see this sort of political logjam nationally in that process. And that, I think, that contrast is quite dramatic and quite hard to understand at times. But then I see it in my own country as well, right? So we have just passed a carbon tax in Australia as the highest, per capita emitter of greenhouse gases in the developed world. We've sort of faced up to that issue, but it was, by one vote in our parliament. It was only just passed. So definitely a line ball. And I think change is difficult at the national level. But people who think locally tend to kind of have more freedom to act, tend to see the benefits of doing that. So making, you referred to the city of Eugene, making the city a better place to live is a good motivation to act, right? Because it's there, it's your town, you're the one who is benefiting from it. You see that your city is more pleasant to live in, has better farmers markets, whatever, has better bicycle paths, get immediate benefit from it. Whereas I think it's more abstract at the federal level. So I think we get more into politics and less into action because the whole debate is more abstract. Whereas locally, I think it's more engaged with the people and what they need and how we're going to improve our quality of life.
So are we talking about a top-down model, a bottom-up model, or working from both ends at once?
I think it starts bottom-up. So I think we're seeing that now. We're seeing it with the level of political engagement. As I mentioned earlier, the Tea Party and Occupy are kind of both the same kind of idea, which is that people are saying the system isn't working for me anymore. Whether that's inequality, whether it's corporate power, the role of government, there's a whole range of different ideological, political views around that, but they're saying the system is broken. And that bottom-up thing, I think, is therefore happening. We're seeing a lot more climate change activism, so traditional, protest movements forming around that sort of issue, I think, which is important. We're seeing a lot of bottom-up, city-based, community-based activity, and we're seeing enormous amounts of investment in new technologies, in solar power. We're seeing there's spectacular growth in solar power now around the world, and being replicated in many countries, including in the United States. 40% growth rates in solar power. Those sort of growth rates, that's a big job-creating engine. So I think at some stage soon we're going to recognise that sort of greening the economy is actually a really good way of addressing our economic challenges, because the old economy will continue to decline and we're going to need jobs and need economic activity, and that sort of new, if you like, that new opportunity to make our cities safer, cleaner, to make our energy supply more secure, more local, is going to bring a lot more jobs than the old industries that are dying ever had.
You had some good figures about the effectiveness and the really near future impact of the solar industry. Would you mind just rehearsing those statistics?
Sure. Look, they're really interesting, because solar has been going to be cheap, in 20 years' time for 40 years, right? So it's always been a little bit away, never quite gets there, and we're there. Right? So now the industry is growing globally at 40% per year, and the prices are dropping at 7% per year. So what that means is that we're seeing spectacular drops in price over the last 5 years or so, and it's rapidly becoming cost competitive with coal, right? So what that means is that at some point soon, if you're an investor from a utility company, you're going to look at this and say, okay, well, I could do a new coal plant. It would take a long time to build, right? It would face the risk of carbon regulation and price going forward. It would lead to opposition in the community, and my customers don't like it. Or I can build a solar plant for roughly the same price, right, which is going to actually have no carbon pricing, is going to have the support of my customers and my community, and I can do it piece by piece. I can scale it up, one piece at a time. And that idea, I think, is going to change the economics of energy in quite a profound way. And then the kind of solar revolution will really sort of take off. And that, I think, will be the beginning of the end of the coal industry.
Has anything taken you by surprise in your visit to first Seattle and then Portland and Eugene on this trip?
I think the only thing that is really, I think exciting and I wasn't expecting, was how strongly there is now a debate about, what's the role of the economy. So the idea of growth, the idea that we are now recognising that endless economic growth isn't sustainable, right, in an ecological sense, but also wasn't working for us anyway. So there is now a very active debate around the idea of growth and around the idea that actually having just the numbers go up in terms of the size of the economy isn't actually working. So at the moment in the US, for example, yes, the economy is sort of stabilised or slightly growing, but the jobless numbers are going up, not down. Right? So we're not getting growth that is actually creating jobs. And that makes people kind of get more granular and say, okay, well, how do we have a different sort of economy? How do we design the economy to create jobs, to create happiness, to give us quality of life? And that's not just about numbers, that's about the types of jobs and the types of activity that we do.
that leads me to ask you briefly about that happiness index. Is it going to be one of those things where we set our sights on a different kind of definition of what makes us happy, or is it going to be a case of making peace with a new set of conditions and redefining happiness?
But I think there's a bit of both. So I think there is a sense where we have to recognise that we're moving out of that phase in Western countries where we need to have more money to be happy. Right, that we actually have enough money now. We have to distribute it differently, we have to use it differently, but we have enough actual wealth. We just don't use it very well to create quality of life. And we have to recognise that as we move forward, we're going to face difficult economic times. We are going to face some big issues globally in terms of food supply, energy prices and access and so on. So I think that is going to be a change that we're going to have to adapt to. And I think that's where we have to get to, is bring those together. And so let's design our economy around happiness, let's design our economy around quality of life, and we can afford to do that.
You referred to that upcoming period of turbulence as a little rough patch in your talk, which I appreciate. And a last question, Paul. You're disarmingly open about your many different career paths. Again, in that commencement speech, you talked about having been a cake baker, you've been in the military, you've been a CEO, you've led Greenpeace, you know this from the economics, from the corporate point of view, but from many others as well. Has all of that shaped your reading of the situation briefly?
Look, I think very strongly. So I think that what it's mostly shaped is to recognise that people are people. And it doesn't matter if they're working in a corporation, whether they're a farmer, whether they're an activist, whether they're a university academic. It's about people, not about institutional structures. And that I'm sort of more open, if you like, to the idea that we can actually all move through this together, and that there is not about good guys and bad guys. It is actually about just working out what we need to do and finding ways of doing that in a more sort of unified societal way.
I take great heart from your unending optimism and your good cheer, so thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
And thanks for giving us yet another half hour of your time.
Good, thank you.
It's been a real pleasure.
Good to be here.
We've been speaking with Paul Gilding, an environmentalist and sustainability consultant. Gilding is the author of The Great Disruption, Why the Climate Crisis Will Bring on the End of Shopping and the Birth of a New World. He gave a lecture titled The Mother of All Conflicts, Infinite Economic Growth versus a Finite Planet. That was on November 15th, 2011, as the Oregon Humanities Center 1112 Cressman Lecturer. His lecture was part of our year-long conflict series. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.